A dog's loyalty runs deeper than most can understand. It's a bond that doesn't break, no matter the pain, no matter the distance. When a stray dog led the police to an abandoned barn, no one could have predicted what they would find inside. But as they uncovered the darkness that had held a young girl captive for months, it became clear. Sometimes, the greatest heroes are the ones who don't speak at all. It was a cold autumn morning when Officer Rachel Matthews received the call. That would change everything. The sound of her radio crackled as the dispatcher's voice came through, urgency in every word. "A stray dog, ma'am. Been spotted wandering around the outskirts of town for days, acting strangely. We need someone to check it out." Rachel sighed, her day already filled with routine traffic stops and minor disturbances. She wasn't in the mood for another stray dog, but she'd been on the force long enough to know that sometimes things weren't as simple as they seemed. "On my way," Rachel replied, adjusting her seatbelt. Her cruiser hummed as she drove toward the outskirts of town, where the trees loomed large and the roads became winding and narrow. The dog was reported to be near an abandoned barn, a place many people had avoided for years. Rumor had it that the barn was haunted, or at least that's what the kids in town liked to believe. When Rachel arrived, the dog was sitting quietly near the barn's dilapidated door. It was a medium-sized, scruffy thing with fur that looked like it hadn't been washed in months. Its coat was matted, and its eyes, though weary, were alert. The moment Rachel stepped out of the car, the dog's ears perked up. It tilted its head, studying her as if it knew something she didn't. Rachel approached cautiously, trying not to spook it. She kneeled down slowly, her voice soft and calm. "Hey, buddy. You lost?" The dog didn't move, but it seemed to recognize her calm demeanor. It took a few hesitant steps forward, its tail wagging ever so slightly. There was a slight limp in its movement, a sign of past injury. "Where's your owner?" Rachel muttered to herself. She ran her fingers through the dog's coat, feeling the roughness of the fur against her hand. The dog sat, staring up at her with those large, soulful eyes. Then, it did something that surprised Rachel. It turned and looked at the barn, then back at her as if trying to communicate something. Rachel followed the dog's gaze, her brow furrowing. "You want me to go in there?" she asked. The dog's response was subtle, a soft whine, followed by a low growl that seemed to carry an unsettling urgency. Rachel stood up, feeling a chill run down her spine. Something was off. But she had her job to do, and this wasn't a normal stray dog situation. There was more to this, something in the way the dog had behaved. "All right, I'll check it out," she said, her voice firm. She took a cautious step toward the barn door, the dog close behind her, never straying too far. As Rachel reached for the door handle, the dog whimpered again, and this time it nudged her leg gently, as though urging her forward. The sense of mystery gnawed at Rachel, but it was clear that the dog wasn't leading her astray. There was something, or someone, inside that barn. Something the dog needed her to find. Rachel took a deep breath, pushing open the door. The hinges creaked loudly, the sound echoing in the silent morning air. And then, with the dog by her side, she stepped into the shadows of the barn, not knowing that what lay ahead would shatter her heart in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The barn smelled of musty hay and decay. The dim light from the cracked barn windows barely illuminated the space, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. The air felt thick, heavy with a sense of abandonment and forgotten memories. Rachel's footsteps echoed as she ventured deeper into the barn, the stray dog following closely behind her. It trotted silently, its eyes constantly darting around, as if keeping watch. Rachel paused, scanning the area with her flashlight, the beam of light flickering across old farming tools, broken crates, and the remnants of a once-used barn. There was nothing unusual. At least, not yet. The dog whined softly, and Rachel noticed it moving toward the far corner of the barn. Her eyes narrowed, curiosity growing. "Do you know something I don't?" she murmured, more to herself than the dog. The animal's ears twitched at her voice, but it didn't stop moving. It was heading toward an old, tattered curtain that hung loosely over a section of the barn, blocking her view of what lay beyond. Rachel felt her heart begin to race. She had worked enough cases to know that when something felt wrong, it usually was. She gripped her flashlight tighter, her breath steadying as she approached the curtain. The dog, almost as if it were urging her to hurry, nudged her leg. Rachel crouched down, the dog's presence comforting her as much as it unsettled her. She pulled the curtain aside with one swift motion. The sight before her made her stomach drop. A small, rusted cage sat in the corner of the barn, nearly hidden from view. The bars were bent and twisted as though someone had tried to force the cage open. Inside, a young girl was curled up in the fetal position, her dirty face buried in her knees. Her clothes were torn and ragged, and her body was gaunt, as if she hadn't eaten in days. Rachel's breath hitched, and for a moment she couldn't move. The girl didn't look up. She was shivering, as if trapped in a world of her own. The dog sat beside her, its eyes never leaving Rachel. There was an undeniable sense of loyalty in the way it sat, almost guarding the girl. Rachel knew then that the dog had been leading her here all along, not just for a rescue, but because it had a purpose. This dog, in its silent way, had been waiting for someone to find the girl. "Hey there," Rachel whispered gently, her voice trembling. "It's okay. We're going to get you out of here." The girl's head shot up at the sound of her voice, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. She looked at Rachel, and in that moment, Rachel saw something that took her by surprise. The girl's eyes were not just fearful. They were filled with the same deep, sorrowful wisdom that Rachel had seen in the dog's eyes earlier. This girl knew pain. She had endured something far darker than Rachel could understand. Rachel took a step forward, kneeling down, trying to make herself appear less threatening. "I'm a police officer. What's your name?" The girl didn't answer, right away. She looked at Rachel for a long moment as if considering her question carefully. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, fragile as glass. "Gemma." Rachel's heart broke at the sound of the name, the weight of it settling deep in her chest. "Gemma, we're going to get you out of here. You're safe now." But the dog wasn't just watching Rachel anymore. It was watching Gemma. The dog's gaze shifted between the two women, its body tense with alertness. Rachel could feel the bond between them, unspoken but undeniably powerful. The dog had protected Gemma for as long as it could, and now it had led Rachel to her. There was no mistaking the deep loyalty the dog felt for this girl, and Rachel knew it would never leave her side. Rachel's hand hovered over the cage, unsure of what to do next. She reached for her radio, calling in the details of the situation. But as she spoke to dispatch, she couldn't help but notice something strange. The dog's eyes, they were more than just vigilant. They were filled with sorrow. There was something in its gaze that Rachel couldn't understand. The dog had led her here. It had found this girl, and now it was waiting for something. A cold shiver ran down Rachel's spine as she realized the truth. The dog had not only found Gemma, it had been with her all along, perhaps since the very moment she had been taken. And somehow it had known that it couldn't save her alone. Rachel knew then that the mystery wasn't over. What had happened to this girl? Why had she been locked away in this forgotten barn? And most importantly, why had the dog stayed with her all this time, keeping watch without fail? The police arrived soon after Rachel made her call, but even with the flashing lights and the chaos that followed, Rachel's focus remained on Gemma. The girl hadn't spoken much more, only shaking her head when Rachel asked if she knew who had taken her. But as the paramedics examined her, Rachel could see the fear in Gemma's eyes, fear of being alone again, fear of being abandoned once more. And through it all, the dog stayed by her side, sitting quietly at her feet. It refused to leave, not even when the officers and medics tried to coax it away. There was no doubt in Rachel's mind that the bond between the two was something unbreakable. Rachel watched as they carefully transported Gemma to an ambulance, her body so frail that it seemed as if the slightest breeze might carry her away. The dog, however, remained just outside the ambulance, staring at the door, unwilling to part from her. "Is she going to be okay?" Rachel asked one of the paramedics, her voice heavy with concern. "We're going to do everything we can. She's weak, but it doesn't look like any life-threatening injuries. Just a lot of neglect," the paramedic replied, giving Rachel a somber look. Rachel nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Gemma's story than met the eye. This wasn't just a case of a runaway or a lost child. Someone had kept her here. Someone had intentionally locked her away, hidden her from the world. And now, the dog was the key. As the ambulance pulled away, Rachel stood in the parking lot, the early morning fog creeping around her, blurring the edges of her thoughts. The dog's gaze followed the ambulance, its tail tucked low as it whined softly. "Come on, boy," Rachel said quietly, stepping toward the dog. "You've done your part. Let's get you some help, too." The dog hesitated, then turned its eyes to Rachel, its brown gaze filled with an undeniable sorrow. It was as if the dog knew it couldn't leave Gemma behind, but at the same time, it knew it had to trust Rachel. She reached out and gently patted its head. "I know. You did good. You saved her." The dog licked her hand, then padded over to the police car, its eyes still scanning the road where the ambulance had disappeared. It had become clear to Rachel that the dog was more than just a stray. It had a history tied to Gemma in a way that neither of them fully understood yet. Back at the station, Rachel asked around, hoping to find some information about Gemma's past. The missing child report had been filed 6 months ago, but there had been no solid leads. No one knew where she had gone, and there were no signs of abduction until now. The barn had been forgotten, a place no one had even thought to check. After hours of digging, Rachel finally found something. A local farmer who had once lived near the barn recalled seeing a man bringing a small child into the barn nearly a year ago. But no one had thought to investigate it at the time, chalking it up to the occasional trespassing. Rachel's heart sank as she read through the details. There had been no record of any recent crime or investigation. It was as if Gemma had disappeared into thin air, her very existence erased. The silence around her kidnapping felt like a deliberate act of invisibility. Rachel sat back in her chair, exhausted but determined. She could feel the weight of Gemma's suffering, and she knew that she had to find out who was responsible for keeping this girl hidden. But more than that, she couldn't shake the sense of guilt that gnawed at her. How had no one noticed? How? Had no one cared? That's when the officer who had been with her earlier approached, holding a file in his hand. "I think you'll want to see this," he said, dropping the file onto her desk. Rachel flipped it open, and her eyes widened as she read the contents. It was an old case, one that had been closed years ago, an abuse case. The man in question had been arrested once, only to be released after a plea deal. He had been living in a small cabin on the edge of town, the same area where Gemma had been found. Rachel's pulse quickened. The dots were connecting, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to hear the truth. This wasn't just a case of a random abduction. This was personal. Rachel leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The dog, this stray that had led her to the barn, was more than just a companion. It was a witness, a protector, and possibly the only one who had known the truth all along, and now it was clear. The dog had been with Gemma through everything. It had watched her suffer in silence, waiting for the right moment to bring someone in to help. And it had chosen Rachel. The question now was, how far was Rachel willing to go to make sure Gemma was safe, and to bring justice to those who had kept her locked away for so long? The following days were a blur of interviews, investigations, and tense moments. Rachel couldn't stop thinking about Gemma, the girl who had spent months locked away, hidden in a barn, with only a loyal dog to keep her company. And as much as she tried to focus on the investigation, the more Rachel was drawn to the dog. Its silent vigilance haunted her. The dog seemed to know something deeper, something Rachel hadn't yet discovered. Gemma's health was improving under the care of the hospital staff, though she remained distant, her eyes often glazing over as though she were retreating into herself. She would flinch at loud noises and avoid eye contact. But there was one constant: the dog. Every time Rachel visited Gemma, the dog was there, lying at her feet, its eyes following Rachel with an intensity that felt almost knowing. The more Rachel dug into the past, the more unsettling it became. She learned that Gemma had been living with a man named Harvey Voss, a name that struck an eerie chord in her memory. Voss had a criminal history that stretched back decades, including charges of abuse and neglect. Yet he had always managed to slip through the cracks of the system, his victims too scared or too silenced to speak out. Rachel's blood ran cold when she realized that Voss had been living in a cabin near the barn, a cabin that no one had ever thought to investigate. It wasn't just a coincidence. Rachel's mind raced as she pieced the fragments together. Voss had likely kept Gemma hidden, silencing her with fear, and the dog had been her only protector. The dog had known what was happening, had lived through it, and had waited for someone to come along and set things right. The dog was more than just a stray. It was a hero in its own quiet way. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that the dog had been watching Voss for a reason, waiting for the right moment. It wasn't just a companion. It was an ally. The dog had been guarding Gemma from the shadows, keeping watch over her when no one else had. As Rachel sat in her office reviewing more documents, her phone buzzed. It was a text from her colleague, Detective Mark Jensen. "Found something. Come to the station. You need to see this." Her pulse quickened. She had a sinking feeling that what Mark had found would be the missing piece of the puzzle. At the station, Mark was waiting for her. He didn't say a word, just handed her a stack of photos and a thick file. Rachel flipped through the pages, her heart sinking with each new revelation. The photos were taken in Voss's cabin. The first few were innocuous enough: dusty furniture, peeling wallpaper, the sort of place someone might retreat to when trying to live off the grid. But then she reached the later photos. They were grainy and dark, but they told a story she wished she hadn't seen. There, in one of the pictures, was a makeshift cage, like the one Rachel had found in the barn. But this one was different, newer, with fresh scratches on the wood, as if someone had recently been locked inside. In the corner of the room, Voss's face appeared, blurry but unmistakable. He was standing near the cage, looking down at it with an unsettling smile. A man who had spent years tormenting others, now tormenting Gemma. Her breath caught in her throat, but it was the next photo that shook Rachel to her core. The dog. The same dog that had led her to Gemma, the one she had grown so fond of, was standing in the doorway of the cabin. Its eyes, cold and watchful, were locked on Voss. Its body was tense, its fur standing on end as if it were ready to pounce. Rachel's mind reeled. The dog had been watching, had been waiting for the right moment to act. It wasn't just a passive bystander, it was an active participant in the story, a silent guardian of the girl who had been imprisoned. Mark leaned forward, his voice low. I ran the dog's microchip. Turns out it was a stray for years, until Voss found it about a year ago. It looks like the dog became attached to Gemma almost immediately. And Rachel, the dog was already at the barn when we first responded. It must have been there for months. Waiting. Watching. Rachel felt a surge of emotion well up inside her. The dog wasn't just a protector, it was a symbol of something deeper. Loyalty, resilience, and the unspoken bond between an animal and the one it loved. The dog had been Gemma's only companion, and despite the abuse, it had never left her side. I'm going to need you to come with me, Rachel said suddenly, her voice filled with resolve. She stood up quickly, gathering her things. We're going to take him in for questioning. But I need to make sure Gemma is okay first. Mark nodded, his expression grim. I'll get the team ready. Rachel's mind was set. She was going to confront Harvey Voss, but this time things would be different. Gemma would have a voice, and the dog, her steadfast companion, would finally be heard. The scene shifted later that afternoon. Rachel found herself standing outside Voss's cabin, the dog by her side. It was as if the dog knew that this was the moment. This was the time when things would change. The final confrontation was about to unfold. But as Rachel reached for the door, a thought crossed her mind. What if the dog had already saved Gemma from something even worse? The air was thick with tension as Rachel stood in front of Harvey Voss's cabin. The dog, its eyes sharp and vigilant, stood beside her. Its presence was both a comfort and a warning. This wasn't just about rescuing a girl anymore. This was about justice. Rachel took a deep breath, her hand resting on her gun holster. She wasn't sure what kind of man Harvey Voss was now, but she could feel the weight of his past in the very air around the cabin. The place was isolated, off the beaten path, hidden among overgrown trees and cracked roads. It was a place for someone trying to disappear, a place for someone with secrets. Rachel glanced down at the dog, which had begun to whine softly, its body tense. The dog had been leading her here from the very start, but there was something in its gaze now that unsettled her. It wasn't just concern for Gemma, it was something more primal, something that seemed to warn of a storm on the horizon. "He's not going to give up without a fight, is he?" Rachel muttered, her voice low. The dog's ears perked up in response, as though understanding every word she said. It looked at her one last time, then slowly padded toward the door of the cabin, stopping just before the entrance and sitting down. The dog was ready. Rachel followed its lead. She stepped forward, knocking twice on the door. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time. "Harvey Voss, this is the police. Open up!" The silence inside the cabin was thick. Rachel waited for a few long seconds before signaling to Mark and the team behind her. They moved into position, weapons drawn. Suddenly, the door creaked open, just a few inches. Harvey Voss stood in the doorway, his figure shrouded in the dim light from inside. His face was weathered, eyes clouded with suspicion. But there was something more in his gaze, something dangerous. "Is there a problem, officer?" Voss's voice was smooth, almost too smooth. He knew exactly who was standing there. "Open the door all the way, Voss," Rachel said sternly, her voice cold. "We know what you've been doing." For a brief moment, their eyes locked. Voss's face tightening, his lips curling into something resembling a sneer. Then, without a word, he stepped back, opening the door wide enough for Rachel and Mark to enter. As Rachel walked inside, her eyes scanned the small, dimly lit room. It was sparse, old furniture, empty beer cans, and a small kitchen area. But there in the corner was a small cage, the same cage from the photographs, the same cage where Gemma had been kept. Harvey Voss followed them in, his eyes never leaving the dog that stood resolutely at the door, watching him with quiet rage. "I don't know what you're talking about," Voss said, his voice a little too calm for Rachel's liking, but she didn't let him derail her. She stepped closer to the cage, her eyes flicking from it to Voss. "This cage," she began. "Where did it come from? Who was it meant for?" Voss's face flickered, just for a moment. Anger, fear, something buried deep inside him that he couldn't hide. "You don't know what you're talking about," he spat, taking a step toward Rachel. "I don't have to answer to you." But the dog, Gemma's protector, her silent sentinel, moved first. With a low growl, it lunged forward, blocking the way between Rachel and Voss. Its stance was unwavering, the growl rumbling deep from its chest. For a moment, Voss froze, his expression one of disbelief. "You're not going anywhere," Rachel said, her voice steady but firm. "We know you've been hiding her. You know we're going to take you down for what you've done." Voss's eyes flicked nervously from the dog to Rachel. His posture shifted, tension, then a desperate attempt at control. "You think you can stop me? You think anyone cares about a girl like her? She doesn't even have a family." The words were cruel and they stung, but Rachel wasn't surprised. People like Harvey Voss always thought they were untouchable. But the dog, the one who had known the truth long before she did, growled again, louder this time. It stepped forward, its gaze unyielding. And for the first time since Rachel had met it, she saw the true depth of the dog's loyalty. This wasn't just about saving Gemma. This was about holding Voss accountable for every lie, every abuse, every inch of darkness he had tried to bury. Voss looked into the dog's eyes, his fear finally overtaking him. He stumbled back, his bravado cracking. "You don't know who you're dealing with!" Rachel's eyes never wavered from him. "I do, and we're done here, Harvey." At that moment, the door crashed open behind them. Officers poured in, surrounding Voss. Mark was the first to grab him, twisting his arm behind his back, pulling him to the ground. The struggle was brief, and before long, Voss was cuffed, his fight snuffed out by the collective strength of the police. Rachel watched the scene unfold with a strange sense of closure. The dog remained still, its eyes never leaving Voss. It had done its part. It had led them here. It had watched over Gemma, and it had protected her until the very end. Gemma, now safely back in the hospital, would have a chance at a new life. A life free from the cage, free from the man who had kept her prisoner. And as for the dog, Rachel knew there was only one place it belonged now. With Gemma. Days later, as Rachel visited Gemma in the hospital, she was greeted by a sight that filled her heart with warmth. The dog lay at the foot of Gemma's bed, its head resting on her feet. Gemma, her small hand gently resting on the dog's head, was smiling. A soft, tentative smile, but one that hadn't been there before. She wants to keep him, the nurse told Rachel, with a gentle smile. It's the only thing that comforts her right now. Rachel knelt down beside Gemma, smiling softly. I think that's a great idea. And as Rachel looked at the dog, Gemma's protector, her silent guardian, she knew the bond between them would never be broken. Not by time. Not by distance. It was a bond forged in loyalty, in love, and in the quiet strength of those who choose to never give up. And in the end, it was the dog who had led them to the truth. The story of Gemma and her loyal protector doesn't end here. It's a reminder of the silent heroes who fight for us, even when we can't see them. But as we close this chapter, we ask you, what does loyalty mean to you? Who has been your guardian in moments of darkness, the one who never gave up on you? Share your thoughts. And remember, sometimes the most powerful bonds are the quietest ones.